everybody. Welcome to my homestead and welcome to my channel. My name is Jared. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine war and a certain turn of events that have just occurred that has essentially escalated this situation. We're also going to be talking about the Doomsday Clock. There are many of you that have sent me comments and emails about the Doomsday Clock. Too many for me to mention in this video. But that's making, big news, and we're going to talk about it. And so, I have a picture here on the screen. Why is this up if we're talking about Russia and Ukraine and all that stuff? This was a long time ago. Now it's been more than 20 years since this happened. Well, it's because I think to understand what's happening in Russia, you have to understand the significance of this event. Okay. It seems to me that President Hinckley declared a particular scripture as being fulfilled when this happened. We've talked about that a number of times on the channel, but I'll bring it up later. We'll take a look at that, what he said in the general conference right after this event. And I feel that the two are connected, both what happened in 2001 as well as what's happening now. Because when you look at the big picture, it all fits together. Okay, so don't worry, I'm going to explain on that, but let's do things in order. First, I'm going to talk about Russia, and then we're going to talk about the Doomsday Clock, and then we're going to look at how it all comes together, what the big picture is. Okay, so we're going to be going to Fox News. This is an opinion piece. It's called Putin's Pivot in Ukraine Will Bring About Permanent War in Europe. Permanent war in Europe. Putin is making significant changes to Russia's military strategy as the war against Ukraine nears the 1-year mark. Let's take a look at the Second Coming timeline that I've put together. If you're new, this is not necessarily a timeline of future events, trying to figure out how things are going to play out, but it's more of keeping track what has happened. And what has happened is back on the 24th of February of 2022, the invasion began in Ukraine. Okay, so today's the 25th, so we're just about a month away from that, but that's when it occurred. All right, I'm pretty much going to be reading this whole article because there's just so much to look at and comment on. Let me zoom in. Last week, Russia announced that it'll make quote-unquote major changes to strengthen its armed forces during the 2023 to 2026 time period. So we're looking at the next few years. A sign that Moscow is recasting its approach in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin's new strategy is focused on fighting a large-scale war rather than a quote-unquote special military operation. Okay, so this is big, right? Because this has to do with how the world, how the public view this conflict. It's like an official moving up to a new phase, right? You could call this an escalation. So let's continue. Here's why this change will likely result in a permanent conflict in the European theater. The roots of the war. Russia and US-led NATO, a proxy party to the war, view each other as their respective top security threats. Okay. This is really important. This idea of a proxy party. Okay. Doing things by proxy. You're not actually there fighting Russia. You're doing it through another person. This is the key. This is the key that ties it all together. But I'll explain that later. Okay. I'm going to skip down. Ukraine is the buffer state that each side seeks to rely on in the event of a direct NATO versus Russia war. Trading territory for enemy's blood to protect the heartland is the essence of this approach. It is why the question of control over Ukraine has been festering since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And it is where the balance of power in Eurasia has been contested for centuries. Okay, so Ukraine strategically is very important. If there was a war, just a big full scale war between Russia and NATO, at that point it would basically be World War III. My thoughts as I get into the later part of this video is that we are essentially already in World War III, and it's not just because of my good ideas. I have concrete things to show you. All right, but continuing on. Having won the Cold War, the US has been incorporating Ukraine into the Western orbit, allowing the US and Europe to reduce their military posture in Europe. Ukrainians are valiantly fighting the Russians, having sacrificed thousands of military personnel and 20,000 to 40,000 civilians to death or injury to hold the line, while the majority of NATO countries, 22 of 30, fail to contribute the required 2% of GDP towards common defense. Washington views the arming of Ukraine as a sound investment to bleed the Russian military. Okay, so there's that proxy um, part, right? The benefit of using proxies is that you don't have to um, sacrifice your people in your things that you need for your own nation. It's like someone else is doing it for you. Okay. Russia has been invaded 3 times in the last 200 years and has seen its buffer zone with NATO reduced to as little as 100 miles. After the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, has drawn a red line over Ukraine. All right, so that buffer that Russia depends on to kind of keep some space between them and NATO, it has been reduced. NATO keeps getting bigger, right? There's not really an equivalent when it comes to Russia. They do have a thing called, okay, first let's pull up the map. Russia. They do have this weird little thing called, what is it? Okay, Russia, Belarus, Union. Yeah, Union State. So there's this, I don't know really what you call it. The Union State or Union State of Russia and Belarus is a supranational union. Okay, so that's what you would call it. A supranational union consisting of Belarus and Russia. So here's Belarus right here, and here's Russia. So that's what Russia has. And then, of course, they have allies, but they don't have really anything that's equivalent to NATO, where you have like a pretty vast diversity of nations, a lot of them uh, that are poised against you, if you're Russia. It's a very big, a very strong military alliance of some of the strongest countries in the world, including, of course, the United States. Okay. So, and I'm not making a case for anybody, for neither side, because I think the world is very complicated. You can't just see it in black and white terms of like, oh, it's Russia versus the West. There are individuals, there are secret combinations, there are all levels of people and hands that are in this thing, right? I don't think it's just cut and dry. It's very complicated. So I'm not making a case for anybody here. What I am making a case for is that things are going south really fast, and that has implications for the proximity of the Second Coming and potentially things spreading down here to Jerusalem. Because we know that when things get down here and Jerusalem is under siege, that's really when it's about to happen. That's when it does happen, when Christ comes to the Jews after his other appearances elsewhere, which I think have already probably commenced. Okay, so let's go back. All right. Moscow views NATO expansion into Ukraine in the same way as if a Russia-led collective security, okay, as if a Russia-led collective security treaty organization moved into Mexico, right? That might feel a little bit uncomfortable if we were like over here and then suddenly Mexico's like, hey, you know what? We really like Russia. We want to have a military alliance with Russia. Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. We would not be okay with it. And then, of course, Russia's not okay with Ukraine taking that route. So, um, okay, so in other words, the outcome of this war is existential for Putin, who is determined to keep Ukraine away from NATO, even if he has to destroy it. Yeah, and I think that's right. I think that's right. Makes complete sense. There's no reason for me to believe contrary to that. So again, existential. Why would he be concerned about Russia, um, its existence, or at least how it exists right now? Why is he concerned about that? Why, does it seem to you guys like the West wants to invade Russia and take over? Um, you might make the case, well, the West would want to change the government over there, make Russia itself, kind of like bring Russia into the Western orbit and not really have a Western orbit, just at this point, European, American orbit. I don't know. But as far as like you know, invading Russia, that doesn't really make sense, does it? Well, again, I'm going to show you how he may have some valid concerns. He may have some valid concerns, and it has to do with this proxy idea. So let's go back. Okay, all out war strategy. Putin believes his ultimate fear of having to fight a conventional war with NATO is becoming reality. So, conventional war, if and I'm not trying to talk down anybody, just there's all different levels of understanding here on the channel. A conventional war is what you would think of as just like a regular war. Like World War II is conventional war. Uh, Not like a Cold War, not a nuclear war, a conventional war, not a cyber war. Okay. The arrival of 100 Ukrainian troops in Oklahoma to train on the Patriot missile defense system and the Pentagon's commitment to provide 50 Bradley fighting vehicles to Kyiv is taking the conflict to a new level. In case you don't know what those are, Patriot missile system. I'm sure many of you already do, but just so you can get an idea of what we're talking about here, it's this right here. This is the Patriot missile system. They've already been using this, and this has been like really big for Ukraine, in them defending themselves. And then Bradley fighting vehicle. We had like 1 billion of these at Fort Hood. It looks like a tank, but it's not. It's you can use it for like the cavalry scouts use this. It's also like a troop carrier essentially. And even though it has this turret right here, this is not like a big cannon like on a regular tank. Although it does have this turret, but this is a Bradley. Okay. All right. So that's what the United States is giving to them. Well, okay, so they're training their troops on the Patriot missile defense system, and then they're giving 50 Bradleys to Ukraine. Putin is moving to an all-out war strategy developed on his orders after the Russian military strategists forecast a direct confrontation with NATO a decade ago. In anticipation of retaliation by Ukraine and possibly NATO to his massive escalation in the theater, Putin is fortifying Moscow to protect himself, his family, and the Russian elites. So he's worried that because of this escalation, Ukraine or maybe even NATO itself, which that's a pretty wild um, possibility. I feel like it's unlikely, but because if NATO did this, it would definitely lead to World War III. Ukraine, probably not. But either way, he's fortifying Moscow. Pantsir anti-aircraft systems were reportedly installed on several rooftops in central Moscow, including near the Kremlin, on top of the Ministry of Defense building, and near Putin's Valdai residence in Russia's Novgorod region. The system is placed on combat alert. All right, so what's the Pantsir system? It's this right here. You see this thing on top of this truck? It's not the truck, okay? You can mount it on top of a truck like this, or you can mount it on top of a tank chassis. But the system is this thing right here on top with all these. I don't know what you call this, but you know where the rockets come out. So this is the anti-aircraft system. These are being installed on rooftops in Moscow, and you know what we just read. Okay, he's putting these up. And I don't think you do that unless you think that it's a real possibility. On December 22nd, Putin, for the very first time, referred to the conflict in Ukraine as war rather than a special military operation. Fighting a large-scale war based on the Russian military doctrine is a different animal than a special operation. It involves a lot more personnel, new generation weapons, and cyber and space warfare capabilities. So I don't know. I guess they haven't been using those things before. Um, in terms of new generation weapons, cyber, space warfare. Russia believes that Russia believes what it views as America's low tolerance for casualties and reliance on technology as vulnerabilities. In contrast, okay, on December 21st, Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu announced a plan to beef up Russia's military from 1 to 1.5 million. Towards this goal, Russia is adding 500,000 conscripts, according to Ukraine's defense intelligence, to the previously mobilized 315,000 additional soldiers. Now, to me, that's big news because I did videos about this when the invasion wasn't going very well. And so he's like, okay, we need 300,000 men. And that's when there was this mass exodus out of the country. I did a story on that. I tried to track down all the different countries, but literally what I was able to find is that literally every single country that borders Russia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, well, no, wait, not, well, maybe Ukraine. I can't remember. Georgia, you had men that were fleeing the country because they didn't want to be part of this war. The only one I wasn't able to find was people escaping to China. But Mongolia, yes. Kazakhstan, yes. Georgia, so forth. Okay, that was with 300,000. Not even 315. When I did the video, it was only 300,000. So I guess some more has taken place since that time. They added another 15,000, and now a 500,000 on top of that. So for me, that's kind of a big development. Last week, Shoigu emphasized Russia's goal to augment naval, aerospace, and nuclear forces in order to guarantee, quote, to guarantee the military security of the state, end quote. Earlier, Putin also assigned the chief of the military general staff, Valery Gerasimov, to lead combat operations in Ukraine, a notable move as Gerasimov is the author of a special anti-US doctrine. Okay, endless war in the European theater. Putin, consistent with Russian warfare traditions, is preparing for a long-term war of attrition. Russia's way of winning wars is relentless attrition of manpower. It is how Russia has fought every war for centuries, throwing millions into the meat grinder to prevail. Now, I don't know if you've ever played, and for most of you, probably not. There's a game out there called Let's see, board game, Axis and allies. Let's see. Let's just pull this up. This is a really fun game if you're a geek. And basically, it's kind of like Risk if you've ever played Risk. But, okay, this isn't really. Let's just go to images. All right, let's just look at this. It's like Risk, but the way that they've geared it is so that the pieces are set up to kind of replicate the general conditions during World War II. And you play as either one of the Axis powers, or you play as the United States or the UK. I think those are the different ones. And then Russia. If you play as Russia, what Russia does is they just produce just tons and tons and tons and tons of infantry, but it's hard for them to put up like more advanced things like tank units and aircraft and stuff like that. So if you're playing in this game as Russia, your strategy is to keep producing infantry essentially to eat up um, the attacks from Germany, and kind of wear them out. And then you just like basically overwhelm Germany with your massive amounts of men, essentially. Okay. So that's how I guess they do that. I'm no historian on Russian history, but yeah, that is true from what I know. The Russians sacrificed 25 million lives in World War II, and their current losses are approximately 100,000. Given Russia's population of 143 million, there's a lot more bleeding that lies ahead before Washington could reach its Ukrainian victory and weakening Russia. Do you understand that? If this gets like really ugly, and I think that's a good possibility because I haven't seen anybody put forward a way out of this, a way that this is going to end. There's not really a way it's going to end because Putin is not going to give up power, unless somebody takes him out. He's not going to give up. Um, and I'm not familiar with Russian politics, but I'm sure there's others that are like-minded. So even if you did remove him, maybe they would still continue. And I'll show you why they might in just a little bit. So I don't see a situation where they would concede or give up. And I don't see a situation in which Ukraine or the West would. So, this is like a very real possibility. 143 million people. Now that's like the total population, but it's just saying that, hey, look what they did back in World War II, 25 million. Right now they have 143 million. So why couldn't they do it again? Or maybe even worse than 25 million if they feel that it's an existential threat. I don't know. Okay, the upcoming admission of Sweden and Finland into NATO will create a permanent flashpoint in the region. Contrary to Washington's belief, this move is more likely to further destabilize Europe than bring peace. Yeah, here's Sweden, here's Finland, and as you can see, Russia shares a border right here with both of them. So now, these two countries that were not part of NATO, suddenly this is going to become NATO territory, and this entire border is going to be right up against Russia, because just like Ukraine, uh, these were somewhat, buffer countries in a sense. Okay, so and last time I did a video on it, it had not really been decided whether they were going to join or not, because there were a couple countries that I think like Turkey and maybe somebody else, they weren't sure if they were going to vote to allow them into the alliance, because it has to be a unanimous vote in order to join NATO. But based on this article, it sounds like that's what's happening. Okay, Russia shares. Okay, I already just talked about that. Let's skip down. Long range disruptions. The lives of millions of people have already been upended by the war, with more upheavals on the way. The disruptions caused by migration, human tragedy, food insecurity, and energy shortages will go far beyond the immediate crisis, straining the US and European economies, militaries, and societies. Now, we've talked about even though war is horrible, or situations that make people have to flee their country and become refugees, there is a little bit of a silver lining to that, and that is that the Lord can direct these people to places where they can come across the gospel more easily. Whether it's people from the Middle East that have no access really to Christianity or to the church, um, or Jews that are in Ukraine or Russia that decide, you know what, let's just go to Israel. It's safe there. I'm Jewish. I probably should have done this a long time ago. By the way, I have that charity that I'm supporting for Ukrainian orphans. It's in the description below. So I would ask you, if you can, to donate toward that, because there's a lot of Ukrainian Jews that are going to Israel. So it's helping to fulfill prophecy, essentially. Okay, the International Monetary Fund warned in a recent study that the geoeconomic fragmentation could decrease global gross domestic product by up to 7%. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot. So basically, reducing the economy, reducing the output of, services, products, stuff like that. Many countries are heavily dependent on Russia and Ukraine for food imports and on Russia for energy. The World Bank recently issued a similar report highlighting the food crisis as the most alarming concern, quote unquote. What originated as a localized conflict is now firmly on a path toward an endless war with international ramifications. Having invested heavily, financially and emotionally, in this existential battle, the warring parties have no exit strategies. This long term impact on Europe and the world will be incalculable. Um, that's not good news, and I'm not one that likes to talk about doom and gloom. We do have to be, we do have to live within reality, though, and just who knows? Anything's possible. We could see nuclear bombs out of this. We could see this spreading into World War III. We could see this spreading down into the Middle East. And again, I'm going to show you why in a little while. So, okay, so Russia, to sum it up, from their perspective and the way that they're going to sell it to the world and to their people, is that, okay, this is no longer just a special military operation. It's not just um, a small military conflict. We are now going full blown war machine. You know, we're fortifying Moscow, okay, with anti-aircraft systems. Um, Now here we have Finland and Sweden in NATO. It's not good, and in just a little while we're going to talk about Iran and what's going on down there. That's related too. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the Doomsday Clock because that's related to this. This is Associated Press. Ukraine war moves Doomsday Clock to 90 seconds to midnight. Um, okay, so the Doomsday Clock. Okay, dang it, did I? Okay, I'll just explain what it is in case you don't know. The right here. The Doomsday Clock is essentially, okay. No, I'll just read it from Wikipedia. I'll read it from there. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe, in the opinion of the members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Okay, so it's not an official thing. There's this group called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and they basically put their guess of like how close we are to, uh, well, the apocalypse, right? Armageddon, to Gog and Magog, to the end of the world, whatever. Maintained since 1947, so just after World War II, the clock is a metaphor for threats to humanity from unchecked scientific and technological advances. A hypothetical global catastrophe is represented by midnight on the clock, with the bulletin's opinion on how close the world is to one represented by a certain number of minutes or seconds to midnight. Okay, so it's just a way for them to depict, look, this is how close we think we are to catastrophe. Once the clock gets to midnight, we've reached the end of the world, essentially. Okay, so they just moved it up. They do this every year. Okay, it's they don't keep it updated throughout the year. It's just once a year they update it. And it says here, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the specter of nuclear weapon use, Earth crept its closest to Armageddon. A science-oriented advocacy group said, moving its famous Doomsday Clock up to just 90 seconds before midnight. Quote, "We are really closer to that doomsday," end quote. Former Mongolian President Elbegdorj Tsakhya said Tuesday at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists annual announcement, rating how close humanity is from doing itself in. He said, "People and scientists are warning us, and we have to wake up now." Okay. And to emphasize the effect that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had on moving closer to theoretical doomsday, the group said it was also announcing the clock movement in Russian and Ukrainian languages for the first time. Quote, "Putin has repeatedly raised the specter of nuclear use," said Steve Fetter, dean of the graduate school and public policy professor of the University of Maryland. Quote, "Putin has given no indication that he's willing to accept defeat. He might make desperate moves if no other options are available that he regards as acceptable." So he's talking about the use of nuclear weapons. It's like I've said before, if you're playing a board game, I don't know if you've ever been in this situation, but someone gets really frustrated because the game gets to a certain point where one player is kind of like cornered and the writing is on the wall. And so that person gets so upset that they flip the board. And I'm not going to comment on whether I've done that myself or not. Back when I was a teenager, it was a long time ago. But seriously, this is not a game. This is the world. And well, that might just happen with Putin. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. He could decide to flip the board and just send off nuclear missiles to wherever, you know. Who knows what he'll do? In response to that, the Hill says, Kremlin, Doomsday Clock moving closer to midnight, really alarming. The Kremlin said the Doomsday Clock moving closer to midnight is, quote unquote, really alarming, as it's the closest point it's been thus far to worldwide destruction amid ongoing international tensions stemming from Russia's war with Ukraine. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which has maintained the clock since 1947 to keep track of how close the world is to total annihilation, moved the clock to 90 seconds to midnight on Tuesday, which is 10 seconds closer than it was a year before. The previous record of 100 seconds to midnight was set in 2020. In the clock's history, midnight has been as far away as 17 minutes, interesting number, which happened in 1991 at the end of the Cold War. Midnight has typically been close to 10 or more minutes away throughout much of the clock's history. Okay, so 10 or more minutes away. And right now, according to them, they have it set at 90 seconds. The bulletin said the main factor for the move was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the increased risk of the use of nuclear weapons. The move came ahead of Germany and the United States both committing to sending battle tanks to support Ukrainian defenses. Now, this is not the same as the Bradleys. I think I had read somewhere else. I should have pulled this up. U.S. Abrams tank Ukraine. Let's just see. Yeah, look at that. CNN. U.S. finalizing plans to send approximately 30 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. This is the main battle tank of the United States military. The Army and the Marine Corps use this. So it's not just the Bradley fighting vehicles, which are primarily, infantry. They're basically mechanized infantry. I think that's technically what you would refer to those units as. But they're not tanks. They're just basically armored carriers with like a big machine gun type turret on top. But they're going to be sending actual tanks, the Abrams, 30 of them to Ukraine. So going back here, so both the United States and Germany are going to be sending battle tanks. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has warned that Russia is planning for, quote, a new wave of aggression, end quote, requiring a stepped up response from the international community. Yikes. On the Wikipedia article for the Doomsday Clock, it has, you see this right here, this graph. This shows you the seconds to midnight. So the higher up you are, the further away from midnight you are. And right now, it's at its lowest point. Now, there's been criticism of the Doomsday Clock. I was reading on Fox News. There were some people that are like, this is just a joke. It's whatever. And they might be right. I mean, just because it's a group of scientists, what the heck do they know? But I still think it might be useful, something to think about. They're not dumb. They're not stupid people. But in this case, I don't know. I think I might agree, primarily because of what we know is going on in the world and all these other signs that are happening that are pointing to the second coming. So that's why I feel like, well, yeah, maybe you guys are right. Maybe it is closer than it's ever been. And we're going to take into consideration in just a second the big picture. The big picture. So the clock started at 11:53. Okay, that was like the starting point. I don't know why they chose that number, but that's what they chose. You can go through time here, and then you go all the way down to the bottom to 2023, and now it's 11:58 and 30 seconds. Okay, 11:58 and 30 seconds. So, anyway, you can take this seriously or not. Who knows how accurate they actually are. Now, let's get into the big picture. The big picture. Here we go. I've basically already done a video covering this, but it's worth repeating. And I feel like this gives you the actual context of what's going on in the world. Okay. I do believe there's a very good possibility that we are currently in World War III. And it's been going on since this. Okay. I'm going to show you why. I remember exactly when this happened. I'm sure that most of you did too, if you were alive at the time. I was in high school. I was a senior, and that particular day, when I first saw this, it was morning, and I was in a class, and I was actually learning Excel. right? The spreadsheets that I use, I learned it back in high school. So I was in my class learning Excel. I was done with my assignment, and the TVs came on. Okay, all the classrooms had a TV that came on, and they were showing the footage of what was going on in New York. And I was confused because at first there was just the one building, and they didn't really know what was going on as far as like what they were reporting on the news. They were just like, "Oh, seems like a small plane or something hit." And I was like, "Why would they put this on?" Like, okay, well, yeah, that's not good, but whatever. So they had it on. It was causing a big stir. I was done with my assignment, so for the rest of my time in class, I was able just to do whatever I wanted on the internet. And even back then, I was a pretty big news junkie, and I could not get through to any of my typical news sites that I would check. Like they were all bogged down with traffic, right? And then as the day progressed, um, I went to beginning guitar, so I wasn't aware when the second one was hit. And then later after lunch, and then when I was in seminary, uh, someone told me that they had both fallen down, and I was like, "What? They both fell down? They all the way? They're all the way gone?" Yep, all the way gone. And then at that point, I was like, "Holy cow! This is huge. This is huge." I rode the bus home that day because I didn't have a car. I was just had to ride the bus, and there was no traffic in the sky because in Salt Lake, anywhere you are in the valley, when you look toward like the center of the valley, there's what's it called, like a flight path for departures and arrivals out of Salt Lake International, and it's always busy. It's always busy. Any given time, you can look at that part of the sky, you're going to see a plane. And that day, there were none because all air traffic was all all flights were grounded in the United States. This was huge. This was a huge, huge thing. And I think it's so much bigger than just this. Okay. So I've shared this before. This is from Salon. Um, they're generally against Christian values and things like that. But this is a very interesting article. Okay. This is from October 12th, 2007. So this is a very old article. Look what it says, though. 7 countries in 5 years. While the Bush White House promotes the possibility of armed conflict with Iran, a tantalizing passage in Wesley Clark's new memoir suggests that another war is part of a long planned Department of Defense strategy that anticipated regime change by force in no fewer than 7 Mideast states. Critics of the war have often voiced suspicions of such imperial schemes, but this is the first time that a high ranking former military officer has claimed to know that such plans existed. The existence of that classified memo would certainly cast more dubious light not only on the original decision to invade Iraq because of Saddam Hussein's weapons and ambitions, but on the current efforts to justify and even instigate military action against Iran. In A Time to Lead for Duty, Honor, and Country, published by Palgrave Macmillan last month, the former 4-star general recalls 2 visits to the Pentagon following the, 2001. On the first visit, less than 2 weeks after 9/11, he writes a senior general told him, "We're going to attack Iraq. The decision has basically been made." Now, if you don't remember, or if you're young, okay, Iraq wasn't invaded until 2 years later. So the war in Afghanistan started that self same year. And then 2 years later, in 2003, that's when the Iraq War started. Okay, so what he's saying here is that this General Wesley, he had come in contact with somebody that knew that were already plans to go into Iraq. Okay, that was already in the plans. 6 weeks later, Clark returned to Washington to see the same general and inquired whether the plan to strike Iraq was still under consideration. The general's response was stunning. Quote, "Oh, it's worse than that," he said, holding up a memo on his desk. "Here's the paper from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, then Donald Rumsfeld, outlining the strategy. We're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years." And he named them, starting with Iraq and Syria and ending with Iran. While Clark doesn't name the other 4 countries, he has mentioned in televised interviews that the hit list included Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, and Sudan. Okay, so let's just pretend, and I'm not saying that you have to accept this, but let's pretend that this is real. That actually there was a plan in place, most likely involving modern day Gadianton robbers, secret combinations, um, people that have influence, right? Control, power, wanting to do this for any number of ends. It doesn't just have to be one thing. There can be multiple parties that benefit from this. Okay, so let's pretend that this is real. Okay, it may or may not be. Now let's read. Gosh, I thought I had this all organized right. Now let's read this. Okay, this is from Internet Archive. That's that website I always use to look at Millennial Messiah, Mormon Doctrine, Doctrines of Salvation. It's an online library. And one thing that they have as part of that library is they have something called the Wayback Machine. It's an internet archive, so you can go back and see websites that are no longer available. So you have this one. This is from ABC News Online. So this is how the website originally appeared. This is what the internet looked like back in 2006. And this one, this article from ABC News Online says, Bush likens war on terror to World War III. U.S. President George Bush has referred to the war on terror as World War III during a television interview. Mr. Bush told the CNBC television network the revolt of passengers on the hijacked Flight 93 on September 11th was the first counterattack to World War III. He said he agreed with the description of David Beamer, whose son Todd died in the crash, in a Wall Street Journal commentary last month. The act was our first successful counterattack in our homeland in this new global war, World War III. Mr. Bush said, "I believe that. I believe that was the first counterattack to World War III." So, what do you think? There's more though. There's more. I'm about to show you more. It doesn't stop there. You know, I've done a couple of videos, by the way. I've already covered the Doomsday Clock 10 months ago, so you can check out that video. I talk about some other interesting concepts where it seems like the world, they are aware of the time that we're living in. The fact that they chose a clock to represent Doomsday. You think about what we know as a church, that every 1,000 years is a day in God's time. And this next day that we're going into is the Sabbath of years. So, when Christ comes, it's going to open up this new day, and it is going to be doomsday for the wicked. It is. And it seems like there's been people trying to get into space as though they have a way to escape what's coming. Jeff Bezos made this 10,000 year clock, seemingly to mock God. That no, we're still going to be here. We're going to be here for another 10,000 years. So you can check out this video. It's an older one. So I've done a video on that. I also did a video similar to what we're talking about right now. Did World War III start in 2001? And in that video, I pulled up, I shared this picture. This is my Army dress uniform, okay, my ASUs. And you can see my ribbons right here. This one right here, this is the ribbon that I got for being part of the global war on terrorism. Basically, all you have to do to get this is be well, I don't know the specific requirements, but essentially it's be in the U.S. military during the years of the global war on terrorism. Okay, so this is one of the medals that I had, um, and I may come to find out later, once the history books are all written, that in reality I was a soldier during World War III. Although that's not how I viewed it at the time, right? And many of you have this as well if you've been in the military. So, the global war on terror started with this. Okay, it started with 2001. And according to this article, it's still ongoing. It hasn't ended, it's still going. In this article that shows you the medal, it says the medal recognizes those military service members who have supported operations to counter terrorism in the war on terror from the 11th of September 2001 to a date yet to be determined. So if this article is still up to date, then they're still issuing these out. People are still receiving this as a ribbon for their uniforms. Um, okay, so Salon reports. General Wesley Clark is saying that he knew this was meant to be a wide, like a really big plan that would affect multiple countries. President Bush is quoted as having said that he believes that this is World War III. Okay, now let's look at this. Russia and the Color Revolution. All right. The British strategist Liddell Hart stressed the need to understand rival views of grand strategy and military developments, or the other side of the hill. So, in other words, if you're going to be fighting somebody, you should probably know how they view things and what their frame of mind is, what they think is happening. A range of Russian and Belarusian military and civil experts presented a very different view of global security and the forces behind it at the Russian Ministry of Defense's third Moscow Conference on International Security on May 23rd, 2014. The first session of the conference presented an overview of the security situation, focusing on what Russian experts called the Color Revolution. Russian analysts have used the term since the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2012 in discussing the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004 and the Tulip Revolution that took place in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. Russian military officers now tied the term color revolution to the crisis in Ukraine and to what they saw as a new US and European approach to warfare that focuses on creating destabilizing revolutions in other states as a means of serving their security interests at low cost and with minimal casualties. It was seen as posing a potential threat to Russian this is weird how it was seen as posing a potential threat to Russian in the near abroad to China and Asia states not aligned with the US and as a means of destabilizing states in the Middle East, Africa, Central Asia, and South Asia. Okay, so let's pause right there. There's more to read. But do you understand what this is saying? This is saying that essentially instead of engaging in normal conventional warfare to further your security interests and other interests, instead of you going in and fighting, what you do is you get them to you get the population there to rise up and take care of it for you. So you basically just help them uh, defeat themselves. Whatever the power is at the time, the regime, whatever, instead of you sending your troops or your intelligence officers or whatever to go and take care of it, you just get the people to do it themselves. It's cheaper. You know, the United States and Europe are technologically advanced, so I seem to remember that when the Arab Spring was going on, that Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that were actually kind of a key part of them overthrowing their governments, like Egypt especially. So you'll remember that we had this situation called the Arab Spring. Okay, there's so much to talk about. Well, first of all, okay, here is a Wikipedia article called Color Revolution, and it chronicles all the different color revolutions. So the first one that they have in this article is back in 1986 with the Philippines. Okay. And then 1988, 89, and then 2000. And then, oh, here we are. Now we're in modern times after 2001. I don't know much about these prior color revolutions. For all I know, maybe these were kind of like practice runs. I don't know. But you can see that after 2001, you have Georgia, which was part of the Soviet Union. You had this was also Georgia, so the Rose Revolution, the Second Rose Revolution, and then you had Ukraine. So you have former Soviet states that are being hit with color revolutions, presumably, or at least Russia believes, instigated or supported by, or whatever you want to say, started by Western powers to destabilize these countries, right? Ukraine, Iraq in 2005, uh, Kyrgyzstan, um, 2005, Lebanon, Kuwait, Belarus, right? Belarus is part of that union with Russia, the Union State. Myanmar, Malaysia, Moldova, Iran, 2009. And there's more, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, China, Russia itself, Macedonia, Armenia, on and on and on and on and on. Okay. Well, as a part of these color revolutions, we had an interesting happening specifically with Arab countries, okay, called the Arab Spring. I have this on my tracker. Let me zoom out to 100%. And the dates that I was able to find for the Arab Spring, here it is right here in column G. Okay, right here. Starting pretty much at the end of 2010 and then going into the end of 2012. It's called the Arab Spring, but obviously it wasn't confined just to springtime. So you have, look at these two columns, E and F. You have the Afghanistan War, and then you have the Iraq War. And then around the same time, you have color revolutions going on in Ukraine and Georgia and so forth. And then Lebanon, you have a war in Lebanon. And then you have the Arab Spring in 2010. Okay. And what did the Arab Spring do, or what was that all about? The Arab Spring was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that spread across much of the Arab world in the early 2010s. It began in Tunisia in response to corruption and economic stagnation. From Tunisia, the protests then spread to 5 other countries: Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. Rulers were deposed. You have Zain el Abidine bin Ali, Muammar Gaddafi, everybody knows him, Hosni Mubarak, I think that was the Egyptian guy, Ali Abdullah Saleh, or major uprisings and social violence occurring, including riots, civil wars, or insurgencies. Sustained street demonstrations took place in Morocco, Iraq, Algeria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, and Sudan. Minor protests took place in Djibouti, Mauritania, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, and the Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara. A major slogan of the demonstrations in the Arab world is Ashab, okay, I don't know. The people want to bring down the regime. The wave of initial revolutions and protests faded by mid 2012 as many Arab Spring demonstrations were met with a violent response from authorities, as well as from pro-government militias, counter demonstrations, and militaries. These attacks were answered with violence from protesters in some cases. Large-scale conflicts included the Syrian civil war, which is still ongoing, by the way. Here it is right here. The Syrian civil war, it is still going on. So we're still dealing with the fallout from the Arab Spring, with the not just the Syrian civil war. There's other things happening, but that's like one of the big ones. Okay, so the rise of ISIL or ISIS, right, the Islamic State insurgency in Iraq, and the following civil war, the Egyptian crisis coup, the subsequent unrest and insurgency, the Libyan civil war, the Yemeni crisis in following civil war. I think that's still going on, actually. I'm not sure. Regimes that lacked major oil wealth and hereditary succession arrangements were more likely to undergo regime change. A power struggle continued. Okay, so I don't need to read all this. You get the idea. Okay, they were basically hit by a cluster of color revolutions, right? Here are all the countries right here. And in this case, it was more than just 7. It was more than just 7. But I highlighted the ones that were mentioned in this Salon article, right? We had Iran, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan. And if we go over here, there's Syria right there. We just talked about Syria, Sudan, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon. Okay. So this is kind of a big deal. It's like a new form of warfare. It's a new type of warfare. You can still have war without having lots of your own people die. You just have them fight themselves. That's it. That's it. Okay. So Russia, going back to this article, Russia sees all this happening, and continuing, it says key Russian officers and officials presented a view of the U.S. and the West as deliberately destabilizing nations in North Africa, the Middle East, and the rest of the world for their own ends. They describe such actions as having failed and been a key source of terrorism. They see the West as rejecting partnership with the West as a threatening Russia along all of its borders with Europe. I still don't get that sentence right there. Okay. Senior Russian officials are also using the term color revolution in ways that are far more critical than in the past. For example, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has accused the United States and the European Union of an attempt to stage yet another color revolution in Ukraine, and said during the conference that attempts to impose homemade recipes for internal changes on other nations without taking into account their own traditions and national characteristics, to engage in the export of democracy, quote unquote, have a destructive impact on the international relations and result in an increase of the number of hotspots on the world map. Okay, so that basically is the fact. It basically highlights the fact that Russia understands what's going on, and they understand that they are in the crosshairs. Them, their allies, their buffer states like Ukraine. Okay. So you can see why, if this is all true, that's why they're concerned about Ukraine. In this article, and by the way, this was all the way back. This was back in 2014. So this was around the time that Russia took Crimea and annexed it. Because what happened was Ukraine had a color revolution. They ousted the pro-Russian president. He was exiled to Russia, and then they got a pro-European Union president instead. Okay, and Russia annexed Crimea. So 2014 really was the beginning of Russia's actions in Ukraine, as far as like taking actual military action in Ukraine. Okay, so in this article, this is from that same year, 2014. Putin says Russia must prevent color revolution. It says President Vladimir Putin said on Thursday Moscow must prevent a color revolution in Russia um, and stop extremism, warning of the threat posed by illegal immigration and radical internet sites that recruit youths. Putin's comments at a meeting of his advisory Security Council on combating extremism underlined his wariness about Russia being hit by a popular uprising like those in other former Soviet republics known as the color revolutions. We just talked about Georgia and Ukraine being hit by these color revolutions. Okay. Excuse me. Quote, in the modern world, extremism is being used as a political instrument and for remaking spheres of influence. We see what tragic consequences the wave of so-called color revolutions lead to, he said. For us, this is a lesson and a warning. We should do everything necessary so that nothing similar ever happens in Russia. End quote. Putin's comments also point to concern about outside interference. He said on Tuesday the United States is trying to subjugate Russia, blames the West for the overthrow of a Moscow-backed president in Ukraine in February, and accused Washington of stoking protests against him in the winter of 2011 to 2012. The annexation of Crimea in March and a surge of patriotism in Russia over the crisis in Ukraine, fed by pliant media, has boosted Putin's popularity at home and neutered the opposition. Okay, so and now what's happening this year is we have protests in Iran. And didn't this article say here that things would end with Iran, right? So we have an uprising, or we have protests going on in Iran currently. On this map, it doesn't look like much has happened recently, but according to the Institute for the Study of War, I highlighted the following. So this is an updated report. This is from yesterday, January 24th. And it says anti-regime protests. At least 3 protests occurred in 2 cities across provinces in Iran on January 24th, yesterday. Two protests, or 3 protests yesterday, 2 cities. CTP assesses with moderate confidence that protests occurred in the following location. We got Tehran, Yerevan, and Tehran. So 2 in Tehran and then 1 in Yerevan. The size of all 3 was small. The first one, families of prisoners sentenced to death. The second one, city residents. And the third one, Tehran University students. And then here's the 2 locations on this map. Tehran right here, the capital, and then over here, Yerevan. There was this weird thing here. Judiciary Chief Gholam Hossein Monseni Ajay criticized on January 24th regime-imposed internet restrictions aimed at preventing cheating on the National University entrance exam. Okay, so why are we talking about that? Well, look at this. Iranian authorities imposed mobile internet disruptions to preempt cheating on countrywide tests on January 19th. AJ stated that the disruptions created, quote-unquote, significant issues for the Iranian population, in implicit criticism of ongoing internet restrictions imposed by the regime to preempt and crack down on anti-regime protests. So Iran has been trying to put down these protests. They've been trying to restrict the internet because obviously the internet is a really easy way to coordinate. It's a powerful tool for coordinating protests and demonstrations and communicating and organizing and so on and so forth. So this has been going on for a while. I'm not going to go into the whole history of it, but we're at a point where this big plan, which seems to have started with this, okay, it seems like we're getting toward the end of it, or maybe not, but like we're definitely at a very dangerous stage where Russia is like, holy crap, we better do something about this. We cannot let Ukraine go. And again, I'm not saying that they're good guys or bad guys or that anybody's good in any of this. Um, we learn in the Book of Mormon, especially in the Book of Ether, that everything just goes crazy when you have people in society that seek for power. That's really what it comes down to. It comes down to power. Um, to a lesser degree, it comes down to wealth and other things, but it's basically just a game of power and control. And so I'm just trying to like take this from a very neutral stance and just show you kind of what's going on. I'm trying to be fair to everybody. It seems like there's enough to say that really, yeah, that is what's been going on. That a bunch of different countries have been destabilized. Governments have changed. In this article right here for Color Revolution, it tells you here in this no, sorry, in the Arab Spring one. Um, it'll show you the country, the date, and then it'll tell you the outcome, like what happened as a result of the revolution. So in Tunisia, the resignation of Prime Minister Ghanouchi, okay, dissolution of the political police, da 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 da. That's what happened in Egypt. Let's see. In Saudi Arabia, the result was economic concessions by King Abdullah. Um, Commitment to the expansion of women's rights in Saudi Arabia. In Egypt, the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak. Resignation of ministers. Okay, so you see just like a bunch of changes. A bunch of changes in the way that the country works. People losing their jobs, essentially, not being in power anymore. Sudan, President Omar al-Bashir announces he will not seek another term in 2015. So just on and on and on. So, um, this is a way I think that prophecy can happen in ways that we don't think. We can learn from the past, but that doesn't mean that the future is necessarily going to look the same because people have figured out, hey, we can still accomplish our goals in a much more sneaky way, and maybe in some cases get better results, right? So for the last 20 plus years, it would seem to me that a new type of warfare has been going on, and it's been global in scale. And it has led to actual military clashes, like what's happening in Syria with the Syrian civil war, right? What's happening right now with Russia in Ukraine. So it hasn't all been just like these covert operations or clandestine operations. Um, some of it has become conventional, but I think you could make the case that World War III really is actually going on right now. And the best part about it for those that are doing it is that nobody really recognizes it because it doesn't look like a regular war. It's spread out. It's confined to political boundaries. It's like, you have Tunisia that overthrows their government, whatever. Like, who cares? I don't care about Tunisia. I mean, I love them as children of God, but the average everyday American, they don't give a crap what's happening in Tunisia or Libya unless it has like bigger ramifications. So, yeah, just do war like that. Instead of having like all these troops like sweeping through all these countries and gaining territory, you just kind of like confine it to Libya. And, Libya then becomes its own like little story, Tunisia becomes its own little episode, its own little story. And so you don't have to worry so much about backlash from the public if you do it this way. It's cheaper. It may be more effective, and especially with technology, it's just like it's easy. It's easy. It's easy, right? So massive changes in the world, and how do you combat that if you're on the opposite side? So if you're not the United States, if you're not the European Union, and you don't like how things are going, how do you combat it? Well, I guess you can, instigate some of your own, maybe, and maybe they have tried to do that. I don't know. Maybe they've tried to do that somehow. It'd probably be pretty hard to do that in Canada, or, well, you could argue that maybe it kind of has. There's been, riots recently, like in 2020, and things that kind of have felt like revolutions and stuff like that. So maybe those were attempts by Russia to kind of like hit back at the United States. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert. But you try and do that. Whatever the case, if that's what Russia has done, it doesn't seem like it's been too effective. Of course, I don't know. There's probably a lot more to it. But when it's on your very doorstep, I guess this is the point that it gets to, where you actually have to go in and physically stop it from happening. And I think that's what's going on. Now, how does it end? I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. That's the scary thing about it. Nobody knows. How does this thing with Iran end? How long are these protests going to go for? Are they going to finally succeed? Is Iran going to attack Israel before things go really south? Because like if the protests succeed, maybe they'll give one last shot at attacking Israel. Like, okay, this is it. We got to do it now. It's now or never. Russia is allied with Iran in Syria. And who knows what could happen down here? Things are very unstable right now. Things are very, very unstable. So, I wish I had better news. The silver lining to it is like things like this. These are signs of the times. It means that we're getting closer to the second coming. Hopefully it's sooner than later. Hopefully this comet that's coming. Hopefully it is the sign of the Son of Man. I don't know. But yeah. So that's what's going on. That's what's going on in the world. So that's gonna be it for this one. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe, like this video if you liked it, leave your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. Also make sure to share it, and I'll talk to you guys later.